So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome to the Texas Children in Nature Network webinar, Environmental Education, Measuring Impacts for Growth. My name is Sarah Coles, and I'm the Executive Director of Texas Children in Nature Network, and we're excited to have you with us today. We are recording our session, and so thank you for joining us. To save bandwidth for all of our attendees and for a clean recording, we ask everyone to turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat so I can share your questions with our presenters there. Jenny Larios is running tech for us today. Thank you, Jenny. With the recording, Alice will share the recording in a follow-up email in the coming days. If you're uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and then private message Jenny with your name for our attendance. Also, if your Zoom name doesn't match the name you registered with, please change your name or let Jenny know. If you need a certificate, we do not have your name, we will not be able to provide you a certificate. And just a reminder, if you are needing a certificate, you will need to email the address provided in the Zoom link email at the end of this webinar. And now for our land acknowledgement. Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I'm on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on Indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that work. I'm going to put a few links in the chat in just a minute about land acknowledgements. And now I'd like to go ahead and welcome our speakers for today. Kelly Albus is with AgriLife and Michelle Wood-Ramirez is with the Tarrant Regional Water District. Thank you so much for presenting today, and I'm going to let you all take over.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. It's so great to be here with you all today. I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully this works perfectly.
And I can go ahead and start my introduction. So,
Perfect.
Okay. Yay. Is it good afternoon, everyone? Thank you for signing up and for joining. We're really excited to be here. My name is Michelle Wood-Ramirez. I am Urban Watershed Programs Coordinator at TRWD, the Tarrant Regional Water District. We're based out of Fort Worth, but our watersheds cover about 20 different counties in the Upper Trinity Basin of Texas. So welcome for everyone out of state. I'm really excited that you guys are here too.
Well, thanks, Michelle. And my name is Kelly Albus, and I am a research scientist with the Texas Water Resources Institute and Texas A&M AgriLife. And I do a lot of work with citizen science and education programs across the state, but we do quite a bit of urban water programming. And so a lot of what the environmental education work that I've been doing lately is related to water quality, water conservation, water education. So some of that is geared toward that in this presentation, but we hope to share enough general resources for anybody doing environmental education. So with that, we will go ahead and get started today. We have a really exciting group of people. I've been looking through some of the surveys that you have contributed from the beginning, so I really appreciate that. I'm going to switch to this next screen. If you didn't get a chance to fill out the pre-survey before attending today, here's a QR code. It's mobile ready, so you can do it on your phone if you haven't gotten a chance to participate. And it does include a part where you can put your location on a map. And we'll talk a little bit about why this is useful later when we get into some of the data collection part. And so this survey that you're filling out will also be used as a demo. So this is ArcGIS Online, and we use that for a lot of evaluation stuff. So this is a quick little tool that we'll dig into a little bit more as we go on. So just to get started, this is an overview of today's presentation. And I want to do a disclaimer that for all of us here in environmental education, we know that we do, if you're like me, you do a lot of programs, different kinds of programs with a lot of different kinds of audiences, and you do it for many different reasons, depending on your sponsor or your leadership or your program scope. And so a lot of the time it can feel like you've done a lot of this amazing education and you know you're making a difference, but how do you prove that? How do you show that what you're doing is really having an impact? What are the outcomes that you can measure, and how can you report those findings to the people that you really need to share it with? Maybe it's to generate more funding, maybe it's to continue your programs, or maybe it's to share with audiences and other researchers or program leaders like yourself some of the tips and tricks. So that's what we're going to start talking about today. But when you're talking about environmental education evaluation, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach that's going to work for everybody. There are going to be as many different ways to do this as there are programs. And so what we really hope to do today is start the conversation and help you, with a larger audience here, help you kind of walk through what your process might look like, some of the tips, tricks, and tools that we've discovered along the way that has helped with this multidisciplinary approach. And then also, we're going to try to leave some time at the end for a quick Q&A, so maybe other people can share their ideas as well. But I think looking at the survey responses and from some other conversations that we've had, if we want to continue this conversation beyond today's webinar, that's something that a lot of us might be open to doing. And if so, at the end of this, there's a chance for you to submit your name and email, and we can kind of keep the conversation going afterwards. So I wanted to go ahead and throw that out there, that this doesn't have to be the end of the conversation, but we are going to try to cover basically the steps for measuring, kind of in a general way, measuring evaluation and the outcomes and impacts. We'll share some case studies, the tips and tricks, and then we're also going to focus a little bit on how citizen science can help with this. And for those of you that aren't familiar with citizen or community science, participatory science, it's when non-professionals, so that could mean volunteers, students, anybody, truck drivers, anybody that wants to participate can participate in ongoing scientific research. And this is a really great tool for collecting data and doing evaluation. So we'll talk a little bit about how those tools could be useful. And then also, we're going to be sharing with you all of the resources that we talk about today will be shared with you at the end of this presentation, so that you can try to look back through those later and do it for yourself. So there will be an education resource library where all of the resources shared are alphabetical. You can go click on them. So it should be pretty easy for you to go find it after the fact. But to get started, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, and she's going to share with us a little bit about her journey with the environmental education impact evaluation. So take it away, Michelle.
Perfect, thank you. So some of you that signed up, I did know your name, so thank you for that. But for those of you who don't know, one of the many programs that I help run is something called the TRWD Rainscapes. And this is a photo in the background of the very, very first kickoff grand opening. The board was there. We invited schools, our adopted schools, everyone was there. The Rainscapes program in a nutshell is nature-based solutions, or green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI, green stormwater infrastructure, and blue-green infrastructure. There's a lot of different names, so I use them all interchangeably. And we started with tours. Then the pandemic hit, and we shifted from tours and summer camps to virtual learning. So there's a story map and youth and a high school TEKS align, the Texas Knowledge Assessment, our testing TEKS. So we shifted to that. But my goal ultimately with the Rainscapes is I wanted change in behavior. So what I inherited with some of our trailer programs and different things is contacts. Anyone who saw the trailer, we counted. And I wasn't really, that's a lot of work to train our technicians and train other staff and train facilitators. I'm doing a lot of work to tell people about the environment and connect them back with nature, all ages. But how do I know where I should spend my time? How do I know what's worth it? Do I need to spend 6 months working with communications or different groups, doing printouts, doing vegetation analysis, like making folders? Should it be online? Should it be QR codes? Should it be this? What is my audience and what works? So with the Rainscapes program, I wanted it to be conducive for youth as well, but I also needed it to really impact homeowners, and I wanted to really target engineers and landscape architects and developers. I wanted someone to see the campus was functional, ecologically, and beautiful, and then the learning was an extra side piece that we could do. So one of the things that I had to really ask myself as I have grown programs is there's education and outreach, but really in the last year, engagement has really come as a kind of a third component for me. Outreach would be just those metrics and those numbers, trash bash numbers, or like a booth going out. Education is where I like to focus, is how do I teach? I get a special group for a certain amount of time, a class that goes through, or a tour, a 2-hour tour is what I like to do with the Rainscapes for any age. And then engagement is that piece of how do I follow up? How are they connected? How can I engage them with our community or our science or the network? So to me, I had to focus, split it out in my head. What am I doing and what do I want to measure? I don't really need to measure outreach. I would really like to measure that education piece, what works, and then how can I get them to engage? So that that extension side. Why would we want to measure? Kelly already hit on that. Funding. Do I want to, can I have more? I'd have more fun if I just invited people out and got to talk to them all the time. But if what I need to spend time on is a brochure or a pamphlet or a story map, what do I need to do? So is what I'm doing enough? Is it making a difference? How do I need to set new goals for my program every year? And then how am I going to measure those? That's always been really hard for me. I get a lot of feedback. Well, I'll just ask someone, what do you think? And they'll tell me, but I don't have any of it recorded in a way that I can teach someone else. So that's what I wanted to really capture. We started a Rainscape survey. So anyone that comes and gets a tour or does a virtual tour, the survey is set up for all of that. So how do I measure, and then what do I want to get out of it? And that's what I've been able to work with Kelly on a lot. So
that's perfectly done, Michelle, because that's really what started this conversation. And it's what I think maybe a lot of you may be experiencing, is that you have maybe data that you've collected, but what do you do with it? How do you actually get to that point where you're measuring very specific outcomes that lead to a story of success? And that's one of the steps that we can discuss. This is a outline of a basic process, and we'll go more in depth with each of these steps as we go on. But it's important to keep in mind that these steps really aren't linear. That doesn't mean that you get done with one and move to 2, 3, 4. It's a cyclical process where you do a lot of assessment and you get feedback from diverse groups. And the more diverse your groups are, the more people you're likely to reach with your materials. So if that's a goal of your project, then diversity in the feedback is crucial to making the materials targeted for diverse audiences. Also, you need to be able to revise your program periodically. If you have something that works, that's great. It doesn't mean it's always going to work as times change, audiences change, especially if you want to expand. So it's really important to do this iterative process where you're really evaluating your program as you go, and you built in mechanisms to do that throughout. And so this step-by-step process where we start with collecting baseline data, then you develop what we call a needs assessment, or a way to assess where the gaps are that you with your program are trying to fill. Then you will then design your program and the goals. And this is best as a collaborative process where your goal setting is done maybe with your audience or your stakeholders, because this goal setting as a collaborative approach means you're more likely to achieve success. Then when the program design and implementation begins, again, this is an iterative process. You may have a pilot program that you launch, and then you collect some feedback and you realize this isn't actually working. We're going to have to reevaluate and go back to the drawing board. And you may start all the way back with baseline data again. So this again is a reiterative process that can grow and change and be adapted to your needs. When you get to the step 5 of measuring program outcomes, those first steps are really crucial because you have set up the framework where the outcomes that you're measuring really fit in with the goals and those needs that you assess, so you can tell that story. Then when you analyze and interpret your findings, this is a subjective, anybody that's done statistics knows that you can really tell a different story using the same exact numbers, all depending on how you really did that assessment, who it is that you're talking to, and how you're going to analyze those findings at the end. All of that really can tie back to those first few steps that you made. And then when you want, all of this is really only important, only helpful if you share those results. So if you keep them all in your head, that doesn't necessarily help you gain funding or traction or show success to your stakeholders. So this process, we're going to go in more in depth as with like case studies and specific examples of each of these. And so we'll start with the baseline data. What is baseline data? Really, all it is data or information that you collect, or maybe it already exists, which is really a great trick, is to try to use data that's already out there. There's a lot of people collecting a lot of data, and trying to capitalize on what exists can move you forward much quicker, especially if you have a small staff, small resources. And you can maybe analyze it in a new way. Take a look at it from a different angle. And when you are starting out, that baseline data tells you where you're at. And that could mean where you're at environmentally, like what does your watershed look like? Or what does your stream look like? Or it could mean what does your audience look like? What are their needs? What are you trying to teach them today? And it could also mean what is your landscape like, the landscape of environmental education in general. You may be trying to move the boundaries of scientific knowledge forward. So it really is important to assess where you're starting from. And for example, this is a survey that I gave to a group of high school students, and they were aquatic high school students. This was the end of the semester, so theoretically they'd had a lot of watershed education already, but asking them, are you part of a watershed? And 60% of them said no. And so for reference, everybody is part of a watershed. And this is one of those lessons that it changed how I did my education that day. It also, I thought, was really impactful because how many of the programs that we do in the education programs that we've developed use the word watershed? How many people actually know what that means? Doing this survey was a really interesting way to quantify that the majority of my students from that day, who were what you would say a subset of the population that was learning this, were still unaware of that term. So that was eye-opening for me. And it also changed how I approached those education programs moving forward, and some of the vocabulary that we used. So how can you collect baseline data? There are many, many tools, but I would say that starting with a literature review of the peer-reviewed literature or other case studies and examples from other regions is critical, because it really helps you situate your program in the larger scope of your field. That is really important, especially if you have something like a small project scope, because situating your findings in the larger scope of the field can help make them more impactful, more valid than just maybe your small program's results can provide. By situating it with the bigger picture, you can show how it connects to longer term impacts, which we'll talk about as we go. But it also provides a theoretical framework, or that logic model, that helps all of those steps that I just showed you. If you have a really clear plan of why you did what you did and how it connects back to the literature, you can again show how you reached your metric of success. And if we are interested in something like, say, participant attitudes, learning gains, then things like pre and post surveys are critical, because you need to know where they started to where they end. Otherwise, in many cases, you can't assess impact if you don't know where they're beginning from. Like if you hadn't asked if they knew about a watershed, and then you asked how many of you know about your watershed, your impact would not be an accurate reflection of their knowledge. So interviews and focus groups are more in-depth ways of getting participant data, say, especially with groups that you may not have worked with before. And environmental monitoring is another element. This is a way to get baseline data of your area per se. So if you're trying to show how your environmental education program impacted the environment, then you would need baseline data of your environment to show change over time. So there's lots of different ways to collect baseline data. And the way that you really define that is often through your process, that logic model, or that systems thinking, that way of that plan that you have for assessing your outcomes. So starting with baseline data, I'll share with you a case study of how this worked for us. So this was a program that we did with NSF. It was NSF Civic Innovation Program. And much like what Michelle was talking about, our goal was focused on nature-based solutions for flooding and water quality. In this case, we called it blue-green infrastructure. And we were really focused on the barriers to adoption of blue-green infrastructure. So the science shows that using plants and soil instead of concrete is more likely to improve flooding and also improve water quality. So the science shows that this works, but there's a lack of community adoption. Why is that? And that was what we really wanted to assess. So we started with a logic model based on the literature review, and we used validated survey tools that came from case studies where other regions had successful examples of implementing BGI. Say in the Northeast, BGI is a lot more common, a lot more accepted. So we can use examples from that region to kind of understand maybe what was missing in our region, a baseline of where we were. From there, it was really important to start getting a needs assessment of the region itself. So we did a regional needs assessment, because for our particular area is not going to be the same barriers as another region. So it was crucial that we had some of the key players from the region involved in this planning. In this case, we did a professional workshop series where we had researchers, educators, scientists, water professionals. Some of you on this call were at these workshops, and we were trying to understand where our practitioners, the people who were trying to do this work, what were the barriers that they could see from the beginning? What were the needs that we needed to look into? We used surveys, interviews, and focus groups. And in this case, there was Q methodology and some other literature-based interview styles that helped us guide that conversation and understand the findings that we got. But we also did some classic surveys. And for example, lack of knowledge, that's what this one is here, and perceived risk were two of the highest barriers to blue-green infrastructure, which is not what we would have thought. And in that case, we realized that there was a perception issue as well as lack of knowledge about this, which has really helped to drive what we used for our materials moving forward. And then, of course, more literature review along the way. From that point, we realized with the program planning and design, in this case, we're looking at community barriers, which means we need to hear from the community. And this is one of those key factors that when you're doing program planning and design, being a collaborative process with the audience you are trying to reach helps make sure that those materials are aligned with their needs and actually speak to them. For example, when we started this process, we had a lot of academic language, and our volunteers, we created a community science working group where we invited volunteers and students, educators, community groups. So this was the more community side rather than the professional side. And we invited them to come and share with us what they thought the barriers to BGI might be. And also, how would we kind of make it look more attractive? And what they told us was that our language was way too academic and nobody could identify with that. Big surprise. So there was a lot of we had to change the images, the vocabulary, things like fonts even. And those were really interesting for us. And we also had them rank some of what they thought was the most important and least important for them. So these co-created goals, collaborative development of materials, meant that our program was already aligned with our community, and it reached a lot more people that way. Sustainable development turned out to be another big concern. People were seeing a lot of growth, and that became that risk factor. We thought the risk factor had more to do with flooding. It really was a risk of development and loss of current resources. And so this was a really eye-opening exercise for us to work closely with the community when developing survey materials. From there, we continued to work with our community science working group, which included, this time we invited the professionals back in, volunteers, researchers, formal and informal educators, county agents. We had all of these people involved in the community science working group, and they did feedback on our pilot tools. So we launched surveys and we launched a citizen science project where these groups were able to provide feedback on current nature-based solution sites. So places that already existed, they could go out and tell us what they thought of them through a community science or citizen science survey. This two-way communication turned out to be really key for engagement, especially long-term engagement, because as most of us know, informal education really faces a challenge of sustained engagement. A one-time program is not always enough to really show impact or long-term engagement that could lead to something like behavioral change and environmental impact. And really crucial to this project was creating a pipeline for our community groups to become ambassadors for our project. We provided them with a video hub, so it has video tools, education tools, and resources on a hub page, an ArcGIS online hub page that could also collect data from our participants. So we were able to share resources for them to continue the conversation within their own networks. We provided them the materials to go and have education programs on their own, and also to be able to provide to us feedback about sites that they found, places that they wanted to continue to evaluate. And that was really, really important to generating interest. And it ended up creating a blue-green infrastructure network, which we are pleased to announce is launching this month. And it's actually a grassroots group. These people, after this project concluded, they voted to continue the conversation because it was so important to them, and they felt really engaged and empowered to continue. So this was a really cool example of how creating this pipeline of community support did lead to sustained long-term engagement. So I'll show you what that website looked like. It's a hub page, and really, I'll show you at the end of in a little bit, but we have a site where you can register for the workshop. If you're in the area and you're interested in checking it out, you can come. And also you can see some of these tools that we created for the two-way feedback tool. So this is all in that resource library at the end that you can check out. This really did not only change how we did our project, but how we evaluated it, because our measures of success were different than our community measures of success. And so in order to show that impact, aligning those two made for a lot more successful project and long-term engagement. From there, though, how do we measure those outcomes? And I know that this is like the sticking point for many of us, is actually trying to quantify that success. So great, we have this grassroots group that wants to continue this work. That feels amazing. We want to do this. How do we show that to NSF, for example, that yeah, we achieved our goals. This is a success. Well, that is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but the groundwork that you laid in steps 1 through 4, like a logic model or a system tool, or these validated survey tools. And a validated survey tool is just a survey that has been included in the peer-reviewed publications and validated to where now if you use that survey tool for your study, you can situate those findings in other surveys of that kind, so you can validate your findings a little more clearly through the peer-reviewed literature. But you have to start with the idea that you want to set yourself up for success. So what kind of outcomes can you, through the course of your program, feasibly measure? For example, water quality. How easy is it to go give an environmental education program and then go see changes in water quality? Most of you know that that is very difficult to assess. However, that's what many of our sponsors, for example, would like us to do. So how do we make that connection between environmental education and actual, beyond even in behavior change, all the way to environmental change? And that process can be very difficult to line out. However, if you utilize some of these tools in the literature, it can help you with that process. So your time constraints, your available resources, your sample size, or you're if you're doing statistical analysis, the scope of your program, all of those may be very limited by the size of your group, your funding, whatever it might be. But there are other groups. For example, we use a lot of citizen science data from Cornell, because Cornell has been doing the Christmas bird count for over 100 years. They have 100 years of citizen science data to draw from. That is an incredible data source for us to build our research on. If this worked for them, it could likely work for us too. So drawing on some of those examples that have a much bigger scope than your project helps validate your findings. So this is another case study. We're going to kind of bounce back and forth between these examples that we used to show you how to situate some of this in an actual application. So one of the other programs that I worked on is an Access Water Teacher Education Program. So this is about delivering water education programs as a teacher professional development workshop. And this was a statewide initiative. And we had several goals to meet for this project. We had sponsor goals, which in this case was the Soil and Water Conservation Board. And they were really focused on water quality improvement. Like I said, non-point source pollution reduction, which for those of you familiar with non-point source pollution, it's the difficult one to track. It's very hard. It doesn't have a point source. So how do you measure reduction on that? As well as the implementation of public education programs, just numbers reached. Our research goals were more centered on things like knowledge gains, behavioral change, and how to connect those, as well as meeting water education needs in Texas, which specifically were middle school and high school curriculum for water was lacking. And also student-led applied research projects where students were able to take their research and make it a project for their own local area and drive that research process to teach them the skills of scientific investigation. And we wanted to align with community goals, in this case, teachers. So the new Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, Texas is launching new TEKS this year, which a lot of teachers are nervous about trying to change their entire instructional design. So that's something we wanted to address. But what were the other needs of our teachers? And we really wanted to learn what teachers themselves thought the problems were with teaching education. So we started with a needs assessment through a baseline data collection survey with the teachers. So I'm going to show you what they said. We asked them, what issues with water education do you and your students struggle with most? And this was an open-ended survey, and we can talk about survey design in a little bit. But they were able to give us their own words, which leads to a different kind of analysis than if you were to do categorical responses. And in this case, they said the hopelessness and dread of what seems an impossible situation. Students seem depressed by environmental issues. They think they're not doing the best job of translating hopefulness because they don't feel it themselves. Their students are scared of what's next. Also, they don't see it as a local problem. They see it as someone else's problem or something that they just see on the news over there, which in my mind often will connect to that hopelessness if they don't feel that they can act on it. And so this was a really interesting finding about what the gaps are in water education. And especially, this is what the teachers reported their students to feel. So keep that in mind. This is self-reported data from the teachers about the students. So that's an interesting level of remove. But what experience have been the most impactful for your students? On the flip side, we asked them this question, and they said, this is a very overwhelming response. Being able to teach outside and using the environment as a classroom, actually go and see it in the real world. Go see the real world. They'll see what's happening. Go outside, field trips. If only we all had a magic school bus. I mean, how many of us have felt like that before? I mean, the magic school bus is amazing, but the idea that getting out and connecting students with nature is really the most impactful way. But there are so many barriers, especially post-COVID, things like lack of funding, lack of transportation, lack of subs, bus drivers, things like this. It can really make that limiting. And the teachers were very clear that this was the most impactful resource. So we knew from the start that we had two major things to address: is this depression and hopelessness of a not local problem, something that they can't do anything about, and then somehow connecting that to the real world. So that really informed our program design through data collection. So taking a pause here to talk about how data collection can work. There are so many methods for data collection. We can barely touch on all of them here, but there's a pros and cons for all of them. And I think one of the most crucial elements is existing data. There's a lot, like I mentioned before, there's a lot of data out there. For example, the views. Like if you have materials online, number of views of your materials can really provide some valuable information. Numbers reached, like what Michelle was talking about, that may not be the main metric, but it can be like data associated with a bigger metric to help guide something like motivation or perhaps interest level. Census data, if you're trying to look at demographics or people that you've reached, areas that are undersampled, environmental justice regions, census data can be really useful for that. Environmental data, like we talked about before, maybe there are places that have a higher risk for flooding, and those people are more likely to attend your programs about flooding reduction, or maybe not. And those are all really interesting data that you can start to build in, and they already exist. So it can just make your findings more layered, more robust. Citizen science data. This is an extremely important underutilized resource. Citizen science data, things like iNaturalist, Texas Stream Team in our state, but in other states, there's stream teams all over. There are other places that collect air quality data, water quality data. There's all sorts of available data that you can see from maybe 50 years ago all the way to today to measure something like change over time. That could be really impactful to show an impact of your program, maybe one that you didn't even know you were having. Also, social media. We've done a lot of social media harvesting, where you actually use programs to harvest words or posts or images or even locations from social media. So this sometimes requires some more advanced computer programming, but it's a really, really cool new way of getting data harvesting from social media. And you can get creative. We had some data from people who were waving their hands over signs at places to show satisfaction with green spaces in public parks. So there was all sorts of really cool ways to collect data, that more and more new stuff all the time, especially with mobile ready devices. Interviews. When you're doing an interview, you can do something like thematic coding, where you're looking at broad themes that emerge, or you could do something like Q methodology, which is a really specific way of conducting interviews to get to a goal. Those are really useful for certain contexts. Focus groups can be really useful, especially if it's groups that you have not worked with before. Jedi diversity, areas that you're trying to really reach groups that are traditionally underrepresented in this kind of activity. A lot of the times just sending out a survey or asking to participate in an interview may not work, but a focus group where you really get into the community and talk with them about what their needs and concerns are after building more, spending more time to build a trusting relationship, can be really useful for expanding to new underexplored groups. And then large scale analyses, where you have long-term over large areas or a long time, those can give you things like a trend analysis, which are even more useful for something like, say, water quality trends, because you can then try to dissolve down those seasonal variables and make it a little bit more of a statistical result. Pre and post tests. Those are your very traditional ways of getting learning gains, attitude shifts, which can lead to possible behavioral changes. And then, of course, surveys. And then we're going to circle back to Michelle and her survey, because this is one of those where a lot of people use surveys. We use surveys today. We use surveys for most of our programs. It's one of the easiest ways to assess impacts. However, not all surveys are created equal, and they're not always going to give you the result that you're looking for unless they're designed intentionally. And response rates. We all know that those can be incredibly variable. So there's things like making them fill it out before, or asking them to fill it out before they leave, providing food. These are all really cool tips and tricks. And this is one of those that if other people have had success with surveys and you want to drop in the chat some of the awesome things that you've done to make people respond to your surveys, we would love to hear it, because I feel like this is a community concern on this level. But I'm going to let Michelle talk a little bit about her Rainscape surveys and the conversation that we started on that one.
Awesome. That's I love listening to Kelly talk, you guys. Even though we've gone over a ton of this, like we've been brainstorming on this for a while. It's just so good. So I'm gonna step us back a little bit. So she was big picture, and I'm gonna bring it back to the Rainscapes again. Some of the questions that I had to start with, or I had to start with: what are program goals? Who is our audience? What do I even want to measure? I like to say this, but in Dream World, Michelle World, I would be able to say I gave a tour to 500 tours to 500 people this year, and another 2,000 listened to the virtual things, right? That's our average for the last 2 years, 500 in person, 2,000 in virtual. And because of that, what can I do to say that this amount of acres were saved or converted to BGI or water quality? What can I? That's what I started with. What can I say? How can I ask them? What are the questions? But we can't, it's hard. We can't do that. So I can't go from these are the numbers of people who came to this is the impact that you've had on the community or in your watersheds. I can only make those leaps if those questions in my survey reflect what's been done in the bigger picture. So that was there's no magic bullet. I was really sad. And then I made a survey, and it took months of me working through a lot of things. I made a really long survey. I was really, really proud of it. And then I show it to Kelly and my coworker, Katie. I'm like, okay, look what I've done. This is amazing. I've thought it out. I worked really hard. And then they poked holes in it, so many holes. And they're like, well, if you ask this, you're not getting the information you want. If you ask it this way, you use this word, and that means this result, not this result. And it was a very humbling experience. So, and then it was a very long survey because I was like, I have their attention. I need to use this. I was using it as an education tool instead of a survey tool. I was like, I'm going to give them the data to get the answers that I want, and I'm going to teach them with this tool. And that wasn't the point of the survey either. So I needed to shorten the survey. I needed to give up a lot of my expectations and really focus in on the program goals and focus in on what was measurable, what could I look at. And what we settled on were questions of, did they like it? Do they think they could apply it other places? Would they tell people about it? Because if they liked it enough to go home and think about it and talk to people about it, then it would be very hard if my success was based on if a homeowner could transform and had the money and the time and the resources to transform their whole yard for nature-based solutions. So my success couldn't really be based on, was this applied somewhere else? So we're trying to compromise in that middle ground. What kind of data can we get from that? I have both categorical answers and open-ended, trying to keep them balanced, breaking it up. Again, I had to keep it short and sweet, but I wanted to make word clouds. I wanted to get their thoughts and feelings. And then again, like I mentioned, the vocabulary, and is my audience. Again, I want students to be able to take this, and teachers and homeowners and master naturalists and master gardeners that come for tours, and the developers that I give tours to, and the engineering companies. So my vocabulary and my audience is, I wanted everything. So if you're able to specify different things, that'd be fantastic. But I wanted everything. And then in there I have, yes, I did. And we also included pre and post. What did you know before and what do you know now? I wanted to make sure that there at least was a knowledge gain, even if they didn't fall in love with BGI like I did. And then a lot of stuff that we've changed and over the course of the program, bigger signs, different fonts, excuse me, things like that. That is all informal data gathering. One time I talked to a teacher and they were like, we can't do a whole day long field trip. We can go for a class period and we're local. So then for years, we've been working on these like micro tours. What does it look like to have just, instead of like a walk in the park or a walk through campus, or can you get your bus here for your 2-hour block? What does that look like versus a whole day long program? So none of that's been recorded, right? I wanted to have a place where we could record these things and then no, we changed it based on this. We have adopted this. It did work or it didn't. And I didn't have any of that. It's all floating around my head. So,
and that is actually the perfect segue.
yes.
In fact, I just looked, I'm going to try to move really quickly for these last slides because some of this is like the meat of the issue. And it's what Michelle had just alluded to, is all of these things floating around in your head, starting with a logic model. This is some of the best advice I could give to everyone today, is to build your logic model before you begin your evaluation. And a logic model is usually situated in some sort of theoretical framework, which we'll talk about in just a second. But there's a resource down here. It's like this really great poster where this guy just lays out, Michael Burke is his name, and he lays out ideas for how to do logic models. This is just a way to help, a visual way for people to quickly understand your program. But it's also a diagram of the processes that you believe will result in a desired change. So it's like what Michelle said, how do we start with these outcomes? And so for the Access Water program, the green was my environmental and the blue was my education outcomes that I was trying to assess. So there were environmental needs and the citizen science protocol. We invented something called tampling, which is where you use tampons to assess optical brighteners for water quality, which I would love to talk to you about later. If you're interested, please shoot me an email. But this was a way to actually get people involved with water quality testing, low cost alternative to something like water quality monitoring with a kit. This is very little training, very little kit required. And so they were able to do online citizen science. But then also we wanted to do the impacts on the teachers. So our outputs were a citizen science program, workshop materials, and a community of practice. From there, we were able to assess these short-term goals. It was a 3-year project. The short-term goals were increased adoption of the materials, increased adoption of the citizen science program, but also increased teacher satisfaction. So this was something that we could assess through surveys, interviews, and focus groups, and also improved teacher confidence, which is like the self-efficacy part. Those short-term outcomes we were able to assess through the course of our project. Through the literature, we were able to associate those outcomes with middle and long-term outcomes that larger projects with a larger scope were able to show through their experience. So through this logic model, I can connect my short-term outcomes with middle and long-term that could eventually lead to improved water quality. So whether or not I was able to assess them through the course of my project became more, it was valid data through the course of this logic model based in the literature. So this I will share with you after this project or after this presentation. And it was based on this theoretical framework. So for many of you in environmental education, I would direct you toward this. This is the citizen science framework for evaluating individual learning outcomes. It's a very cool tool to use for environmental education specifically because it's multidisciplinary. If you were to use evaluation tools from, say, biology or strictly education fields, or even psychology or participatory action research, all of these are going to focus on maybe one element of this. Citizen sciences focuses on these 6 categories, which I think are really, really great for capturing the impact of a program. Behavior and stewardship, which will be more of the measurable actions. Skills of inquiry, which will be procedural skills, such as how to ask questions and how to conduct a scientific inquiry. And then there's the content of the science. So do you understand how, like this would be the knowledge gap that you're trying to fill about the actual scientific process itself, say a watershed. Interest level is something that's different. It's actually more personal. And in some cases, this could be something that they're coming in with, their personality, their particular interest level from the beginning. It may not be something that you assess having impact on, but it may be something that you assess of that participant to where the impacts that you have are related to that interest level, because their interest coming in may or may not impact their learning. Also, self-efficacy. This is their ability or their confidence in their ability to go and do the thing that you taught them elsewhere. That is crucial to something like behavior change. And motivation. This is something, again, that you may or may not impact through the course of your program. It may be something that they're coming in with, and it may also be something that's based in their social constructs. So their community, their image, things like this. This could be beyond the course of your program. So knowing these categories and trying to either assess your impact on them or their impact on the participant can be really crucial to defining success. So Phillips et al. This is Tina Phillips. She's with the eBird stuff, the Cornell group that I was talking about. Rick Bonney is another person from this, and this is from the Informal Science Learning group. So this is a really great paper to check out if you haven't seen it. It's in that resource library. So I highly recommend. This is a really great theoretical framework to get started with your logic model. And then when you're talking about impacts themselves, what are your short-term, long-term impacts that you're trying to evaluate? This paper, Arduin et al. 2019, this is environmental education outcomes for conservation. And they did a systematic review of all of these papers that have assessed these. And I thought that this particular graphic was really fascinating because this is outcomes with increasing level of directness. So if you are one of those people who can only get something like self-reported behavior, so surveys, people telling you what they think they're going to do, that's less direct than, say, a direct ecological indicator. However, like we mentioned before, situating it in the literature you are able to take some of these indirect behaviors and translate them to more direct behaviors down the line through other programs that have shown similar results. So I feel like something like evaluating where you are on your level of directness, that helps you set feasible outcomes that you can assess. So this is a more feasible, an indirect outcome may be more feasible for your program scope, but you could tie that to more direct outcomes down the line. Education, often we're assessing something like knowledge, attitudes, or behavior. With environmental, it's often direct things like water or air quality or ecosystem improvements. And with society, it can be something like capacity building, pipeline building, social capital, intergenerational transfer, where younger people are more likely to share a message with older people successfully. Citizen science brings all 3 of those categories together. In many other disciplines, they're separate. So that's one of the reasons I would direct you to the citizen science field for resources for this. For the Access program, how did it work for us? Well, the teacher feedback, we have a lot of these really great quotes from people. Students were able to become more familiar with local water. This will revolutionize how we teach it. I love being able to do this. I can do a better job of giving my students hopes for the future. But all of these quotes aren't really something that, say, our funders were able to access or care about. So this little soundbite here, 100% of teachers surveyed 3 to 6 months post-workshop say they feel more confident teaching their students about water issues after attending an Access workshop. That's the soundbite that we were able to come up with that really summed up our success. All of these quotes verified it, but 100% of, I have statistics to show that 100% of teachers that participated did feel more confident. That confidence we can then take back to our logic model and lead to attitude and behavioral shifts that down the line could lead to water quality and improvements. So that is a key element to defining what it is that you can assess through the source of your program. And then citizen science. Why do we want to use this? I'm going to try to show you really quickly, but I really want to show you guys the survey that you sent us today. This is our, yeah. So here we are. I'm going to refresh so I get the latest and greatest. We had, this is ArcGIS Online, which if you have never experimented with ArcGIS Online, this would be the tool that I would tell all of you to try exploring for a lot of different elements, but also data collection, especially data collection, but also sharing your message with the public. So we had 88, lots of people jumped in since last time. So we can look and see, what does our data look like? First of all, why do I do ArcGIS Online for this? Because I get this handy dandy little map. This is one of the main reasons. This is where you guys all are. How cool is that? People from all over the country and also possibly out in the ocean and Antarctica, but that's possibly just a location issue. But we have a lot of people from all over the country. And the coolest thing about this is that the data that you filled out is all reflected in that little point in space. Why is that helpful? Because remember that existing data that I talked about before, a lot of it being collected on behalf of citizen science. Something like iNaturalist, which iNaturalist is an app that allows you to take basically biodiversity data and occurrences of species. And so if you are able to look at changes over time through iNaturalist and locate it in a particular place in space, and then also locate your education program on that same particular place in space, you can possibly show that there's a correlation between your programs and maybe a change in biodiversity or something along those lines. Having geo-referenced data to work with can really open the amount of impacts that you are able to show. And citizen science is almost always situated in this geo-referenced data, and also with a lot of mobile and low-cost open access projects, which can make that data usable for you and others to help show impacts that you may not even know that you're having. And so from here, we can also analyze our data. And I'm going to show you our word clouds, which I thought was really interesting. We have a lot of Garcias, lots of Michelles. Those are super useful. But if you look at the word cloud down here, this is our positions that we have. And that's one way to look at it. Here is our informal educators. That is the highest, the bar graph, these categorical answers in your survey. This is what this can give you, is a bar graph. Open answers don't necessarily show as clearly to say a funder, but if you have those categorical answers, you get lovely bar graphs. So that might be one reason for using those. If you do open answers, 1 or 2 words, this is our word. This is the word cloud that actually does show something. Knowledge, change, behavior, effectiveness. These are your biggest things that you all are trying to assess. So I feel like this was really helpful for me in trying to situate my presentation today and some of the things that might be the most interest to you guys. But also, I think this is a really interesting finding. We have 88 people from all over the country that are doing environmental education, and this is what they're looking to assess. This is interesting data to me. I hope you guys feel as, I'm a data nerd, but I think that this kind of stuff is just so fascinating. And then we also have what you hope to gain from this presentation. Evaluate, measure impacts of programs. It's pretty clear. That is why you guys are here today. And it really helped us, again, to realize that we are aligning with your needs. So having this particular type of survey can not only help you understand where you're at, but also open the door for all kinds of new analyses that you didn't even know about. So using data that already exists, things like stream data or water quality data or air quality can help you really situate in the georeferenced area. So the Citizen Science Association has a really great resource of evaluation, or a really great page of evaluation resources that I would direct you guys to if you're interested in learning more about that. It is in our resource education library after this. So I would highly recommend that you go and check that out. Moving quickly, sharing for impact. It's important to have a message that's unifying. And I'm not going to stay on this slide too long, but the charismatic megafauna, or that idea that maybe a poster's child or poster species for your message might be the most useful. That's one of the tips and tricks for storytelling that can help make your impact something that everybody's really interested in. So the only other thing I'm going to mention is that storytelling, there's an element of having different voices tell your story that can be really impactful. We had a lot of youth ambassadors help tell our story through the National Geographic Slingshot Challenge. And if you're interested in learning more about that, please let me know, because that is still ongoing. And it is a 1-minute video for students to win $10,000 talking about an environmental issue. So it's a really great motivator for the students, and also for us to have that soundbite part that we're talking about. So moving on, we have about 5 minutes for a quick discussion of some of this. So I want to see if I can just open it up to any questions or suggestions that we might have in our last few minutes, because I really would love to hear from you guys if possible.
We don't have any questions yet, but I have one, Kelly, that I have a feeling
Yes.
lots of people are wondering. If some of us are with nonprofits and are wanting to partner with you on some of this evaluation stuff, is that something that you do? How would we go about kind of working with you on that?
That is an excellent question. And it is something that we're moving more into now. And I would be interested in learning what kind of interest there is in that, especially if there was a sort of working group that we wanted to get together to continue this conversation, share resources, because I feel like what this community of practice can help with is, this worked for me, this didn't. Just that conversation that we had at the beginning about new event software, that sort of thing can be really useful. So I would love to continue this conversation. And at the end of this, we're going to share with you the Education Resource Library. On that, there is a post-webinar survey, and included in that survey is a little area for comments, questions, feedback. If you would like us to follow up with you after this to continue the conversation, there's a place for you to include your name and your email below that. So you can put in there what it is that you're interested in, your question or your comment, and then below that, your name and your email, and we'll be able to follow up with you and hopefully continue this conversation.
Kelly, you might be able to answer this. One of Michelle asked if ArcGIS is free for surveys. I knew there was a free account for teachers, but wasn't for sure.
Yeah, so ArcGIS Online is free. It has limited capability with the free account, but it's usually enough to do most of what you need to do for the surveys. However, if you are an informal or formal educator, formal educators, it's free for K through 12 educators. You just have to go and ask ESRI for a K-12 bundle, and they'll give it to you for free. And informal educators, the license is only $100 a year. And so it's quite a bit cheaper than if you're a formal institution. So they are free, but if you want the full functionality where you can really attach it to maps and do story maps and all of that two-way communication hub stuff, then I would recommend going with the full license. And again, ArcGIS Online I attended a conference where somebody did an ode to ArcGIS Online because it helped keep their citizen science program running as a one-man show for the entire state. It can be an incredibly useful tool for people with small staff, small budgets. It does a lot.
Marcia has a question. Marcia, you want to unmute and join in?
Yes, so, just a second. I am a retired teacher, and I guess I would be considered an informal educator. And I like your discussion question since why am I doing my program? My program is, it is connected to citizen science to help families know how easy it is to become a citizen scientist with an app. I don't collect data. It's more for, I would say, fun. I don't measure to see if my program is working. But one of the things that I'm noticing is, you know, I seem to need some funds, you know? I need like funds for teaching, for transportation, to renew the resources that I use. I seem to accumulate costs, but I don't know how to get funding. I've tried. That doesn't mean I'm gonna stop. I don't know how to get funding. And I need some advice on how to proceed, or, you know, Families and Nature Network has been great for me, but I think I have to like find some funding. Yeah.
That's a really great question, Marsha, and I'm sure you're not alone in asking that question. And in fact, I would encourage you, if you have a chance to fill out that post-evaluation or post-webinar survey, and you can type that into your question, I'd be happy to follow up with you with a few resources, but it's, again, unfortunately not a one-size-fits-all. Depending on the specific program that you're doing, there are going to be more applicable sponsors, but there is, I think, another element of this is by showing the success of your program, it is easier to generate some of that funding. So again, it's a big question that I would love to get into more with you. So yeah, I would highly encourage you to type that into your question. We can follow up.
Sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. We are at time. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I put the webinar evaluation link in the chat. Also, our next webinar is going to be Building Climate Ready Wildly Healthy Places in Texas, a Houston Perspective. And I'm putting that link in the chat as well if you'd like to go ahead and register for that webinar. We did record today's session, so we'll be sending out the recording in the coming days. So thank you so much, Michelle and Kelly. We really appreciate it. Oh, we do have a question. If y'all could just put up your first slide real quick with your contact information.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. And everyone have a fantastic day while they're pulling up those slides. I'll keep it up for a minute so y'all can write down the emails.
There we go. Thank you all so much for coming today. I hope you have learned some things, and feel free to follow up with questions. We'd love to stay in touch.
That's fine. Okay, thanks y'all, and I'll see you at 7.
Thank you.